If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review the companion guide for Vampire the Dark Ages 20th Anniversary Edition, as I present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. My love for the Dark Ages setting in Vampire the Masquerade, or the so aptly named Vampire the Dark Ages, probably exceeds the level I have for the more modern settings of Vampire the Masquerade, for the lore and the intensity of the themes and moods for Vampire the Masquerade are more pronounced and rich when compared to the more modern settings in my totally biased opinion. I also have a slight bias towards fantasy settings than I do any other one, which has probably fed into said bias. Having loved the information provided within the V20 Dark Ages book, I was hungry for more, and was aware that the companion guide for this book served to expand upon some of the mechanics of the core book, whilst presenting a variety of new ones for players and STs to use. Thus, I was curious as to what its companion guide could offer for the budding storyteller, and how it would satiate my thirst. But before I do that, here are the rules to the Lore by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine, but it does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. Like regular V20 and V20 Dark Ages, it is made of a slightly squishy hardback, made out of some form of cardboard material that is somewhat harder than its vanilla counterpart, but it is a tome that will mark easily all the same. Being a source book, it is also much smaller than the accompanying core book. To this day, this book has not been assaulted by my cats, which puts a large smile on my usually pissed off looking face. Similarly, because I have used my copy a lot, one can see the bends in the plastic film that envelopes the cover, most notably across the spine of the book. This does not bother me too much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy some people. My solution to this is to purchase the PDF copy like a sensitive weirdo. In last week's review of V20 Dark Ages, I had complained about the marble background of the book itself. From a distance, both the front and back covers of the book looked marvellous, reminiscing on the original Vampire the Dark Ages design, including a fancy new title font and a brand new Ankh or Unk slapped in the centre of the front cover of the book. Look a little closer and you will notice just how pixelated and distorted the marble is, and once you notice it, you will never be able to unsee it. It is that offensive. I also said some of my other V20 Dark Ages book had this problem, and my copy of the companion guide does not have this issue, but that is not to say that your copy will not either. Instead of the aforementioned Unk, a photograph made to look like a drawing of some Nordic individuals on a boat can be found on the front cover, which can be found later within the book also. The artwork in this book I feel serves its purpose to depict the themes and places in the book, but I'm not particularly moved by any of the imagery here like I am in other books in my collection, with the exception of the illustration found on page 59. The art in this book captures medieval Canaanite life, fashion and warfare in a perfectly adequate, presentable way, none of which looking too cartoonish to me either. When you open the book, you are greeted to the introduction of the book that does an engaging job informing the reader of the themes and moods of the book, as it gives a brief overview of 6 different domains found in the book. Sin, treachery, and political unease are 3 of these themes, and if that doesn't appeal to you, why the fuck are you playing World of Darkness games? Bitter stabs aside, these domains take up 6 of the 8 chapters in the book, with the final 2 talking about how an ST or/and a group of players would go building a domain and new ways to choreograph battles and sieges. As such, this book, as many source books of this nature, are far drier and contains little crunch, by which I mean lacks stats, merits and flaws for players to use. There are some, but we will get onto those at dramatically appropriate moments. Starting with Chapter 1, The Domain of Rome, we learn that the Church is strong, slowly failing to the tyranny of Prince Camilla, often dubbed the Pontiff of Sin. Those acquainted with their VTM lore or possess more than 10 brain cells would know or work out that this is where the foundations of the Camarilla would lie. This can also be seen with Crephius, child of Mithras, whose rule within the domain is first senator, using the Roman empirical word for it, essentially acting as a seneschal. Cainite scholars and inspired VTM lore aficionados would wonder why Crephius is here, under the oppressive thumb of Camilla. That said, more observant eyes would note from reading these opening pages that Crephius is just waiting for Camilla to topple, for things aren't quite what they used to be. You also learn more of Crephius' motives in a later section in the chapter, which provides some interesting narratives regarding Carthage. The reason why I waffle on like this is simply because each listed character in all the chapters provide various different theories and motives for them to follow in each domain, for STs to run wild with or come up with their own ideas. One thing that I think is somewhat lacking are canonical stats for STs to use for said characters. That being said, the lack of stats encourages them to come up with their own with the information provided, creating their own exciting variants of these frightening canonical characters, most of which are lower than 7th generation, in Rome at least, and that is a scary thing to think about. Ancient Cainites who have directed the mortals into what they want them to believe and think about. It is not about entering a new domain and slaughtering everyone, it's a long waiting game. This can be seen with the Bride of Night, a female La Sombra representing the Castle of Shadows based in Sicily, whose sole purpose is to overthrow Camilla, seeing this as a perfect opportunity to do so, using the church as her weapon, as Catholicism is trending at the moment. I do have to admit, however, that this is a rather heavy-handed way of reminding audiences that La Sombra rule the church, using the easiest method possible to get readers to think, "Ah yes, she be mysterious." Whilst I could go into further detail regarding the rest of the Cainites in this section in the book, and as a whole, I shan't, for I do not want to spoil everything for you, and I also have more to discuss with you. The next few sections in this chapter talk about the layout of Rome, how the buildings are ancient, and the catacombs are larger and older still, which are occupied by the Nosferatu and Cappadocians, as told to us by one of the characters mentioned earlier on. This book as a whole follows this format, where the reader is a young, inexperienced neonate learning from an elder vampire. It makes for potentially more boring sections like this far more engaging and organic as a result. Following this are a breakdown of the 13 regions ruled by the Cainites in Rome, which I think is very useful for any ST wanting to run a Dark Ages game set in Rome. What I find irritating with this is that this is the only chapter that has a breakdown of regions like this, which I find a little bit disappointing. I can understand why this might not work so effectively with the domain in the next chapter, for it is much smaller, but it is a shame not to have a clearer understanding how the monopoly in the other domains work in this fashion. At the end of each chapter are ancient scriptures regarding certain clans, which are otherwise known as Apocrypha. Chapter 1 has one for the Bruja and Nosferatu, presenting a new path variant to follow, enriched with deep lore and how some Bruja are transitioning from their Carthage days to humbler, holier ethics and beliefs. The Apocrypha for the Nosferatu talks about the ancient tunnels they occupied, and the other supernatural denizens that live there, such as ghosts and fae. What makes this stand out to me in terms of horror is that whilst tunnels and the like did exist during the medieval period, the catacombs of Rome are notoriously large and expansive, making it very easy for anyone to get lost, and that the Nosferatu, the most monstrous looking of the 13 clans, were the first one to employ this. Obvious as it may be, it certainly beats hiding with the lepers and decaying maggot-infested bodies, which was the only other alternative for the Nosferatu of the time period. Chapter 2 thrusts the reader into the domain of Bath, one of the baronies of Avalon, providing a very different culture and canvas for storytellers to paint their vampiric world. Bath's vampiric culture revolves around the Baron Arcadius, 6th generation Ventru, who is building a bastion, its collective members known as the Praetorian Guard, for the benefit and glory of the baronies of Avalon. Interestingly, the chapter begins with the change in culture that came with the invasion of the Romans through the eyes of a Lianon, and how the Romans ruined the faith and culture of the land, forcing them to adopt to Catholicism instead of the more spiritual paganism. The bloodline choice was a perfect one to introduce the reader to the ye old history of England, for lore reasons I shan't spoil here. The very first thing you read after this is Mithras, perhaps the most important Cainite in the British Isles. His power over Bath is waning, as the Cainites there are on the verge of a civil war, and there is a clash against his doctrine, Mythicism, and the influence of the Roman Church that attempts to brainwash the mortals and Cainites, trying to dub paganism Wicca or any other belief that isn't Catholicism heresy and/or witchcraft. It is very difficult not to feel tense when reading these opening paragraphs, as it feels like Bath is a powder keg waiting to go off, various factions and ideologies rubbing against each other, made all the more frightening when you realise that Bath is not a large city, but a small town over 100 miles away from London, the home of Mithras. That is how powerful his influence is, and then some more, with his cultists working underground. At the same time, I feel a slight solace for the Cainites of the old ways, trying to adopt to Catholicism, which I feel conflicts the weird, almost magical properties of St. John's Almhouse, the Great Bath, and Bath Guild Hall, which actually grants effects to the players upon usage or entering. This leads me talking about Mythicism in Vampire the Dark Ages very briefly, as it does a fleeting job breaking down how Mithras' stat traps work, in addition to the aforementioned Praetorian Guard. In previous Dark Ages sourcebooks, it wasn't so clear how the cultists go about their business, which I suspect was a deliberate narrative choice, but it is much easier to find here, with more information on the whole mythic cult hierarchy to understand it better, to allow one to portray the whole process and its members faithfully and respectively, which I appreciate greatly. I adore this write-up, and I am deeply disturbed by it, as one should be, as the cult have probably misinterpreted the teachings of this Persian vampire, for Mithras is not British by birth, and thus the rituals and rites can get a little weird, as seen on the drawing on page 32. The chapter provides interesting takes on the Bruja and Tremere, in addition to a very chilling apocrypha on the Cappadocians, referring to them as harbingers throughout, as referred to by the gentleman, who is preparing the best of the best to survive a plague. I see you, Matthew Dawkins. I see you. The Ventrue Apocrypha is just as interesting for different reasons, as it helps Ventrue players to essentially gloat about their lineage and the game mechanics how to do that effectively. Chapter 3 moves us further north into Bjarke, a fishing town somewhere in Norway, ruled by Viking gangrel Valborg Crookedeye, who wields a hammer, Christabane, meaning Godslayer, Christslayer, or Weakling Slayer, which I find hilarious as whatever language is being used here, Weakling and Christ or Christian shares the same word. In case you couldn't tell, savagery is this chapter's theme, alongside the idea of wanting to raid Scandinavian borders, presenting a completely different horror element. There is no Mithras or Camilla or any other ancient Methuselah manipulating the kine in a large city, so one has to rule a different way, and that is with a herd, one that has to be used to combat and travel. It is ye old pack dynamic, with Valborg twisting an old Viking tradition into a far more violent and malevolent form, presenting the notion that might makes right sometimes. I am reminded of a more violent Noead concept. That is the short summary of the chapter anyway, so I implore you to read this chapter for yourself, including the weird folklore-esque Fossinglin. Just like the previous chapters, more information on the Gangrel and Malkavians are provided in the form of an apocrypha each, providing different unique cultures to the reader. The Gangrel are wandering Cainites and thus meet all sorts of fiends on their travels. You are told how a stereotypical Gangrel will deal with various creatures whilst on the road, for lack of a better term. As for the Malkavians, whose madness was seen very differently during these times, the reader is told how they may cope in society during these times, which is just a tragic read. The following chapter has us return to Roman culture with Constantinople, which was the capital city of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the brief Crusader state known as the Latin Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Prince Alfonso of Clan Le Sombre in this book. I say that, for I am aware that there is a Constantinople by Night book that goes into greater detail what is provided here, so I shall skip over most of the interesting lore and geography for now, and potentially return to it in a separate episode, maybe. Instead, I wish to talk about the Niflheim presented in the Toreador Apocrypha, which historically is what happens when an angel and human get it on. In here, they are a delusional Toreador bloodline that insists they are descended from the Archangel Michael, thanks to the frightening delusions of the ancient Toreador Methuselah of the same name. That's Michael, by the way. The Nephilim possess all specs, chemistry, and presence, and are not for the faint of heart to roleplay. The same can be said for their own path or road, the path of the Archangel. It and the bloodline are all about penitence and absolution, a harrowing concept for any Cainite, especially the self-absorbed clan of the Rose. This lamenting bloodline is another striking example of a strange cult within vampiric society, not as ruthless as the cults of Mithras, but it is still interesting for me to read these pages and think of the need of Cainites of similar cloth to flock together. Skipping over the harrowing Tzimisce Apocrypha, Chapter 5 explores Mogadishu, the capital and most populous city of Somalia, under the rule of Farnaza of Clan Assamite. Reading this chapter provided a much-needed breath of fresh air, filled with sinister and religious intrigue, as we can read some vampire material that isn't in Europe or America. V20 Dark Ages did introduce new Liabon, kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, and some verbiage regarding Africa, so it is good to see this expanded further, including said bloodlines as important figures in this domain. The change to low and high clans here provides an interesting dynamic, despite me seeing once more the Cappadocians are forever prevalent in Cainite politics. Again, I see you, Matthew Dawkins. I also got rather excited seeing that the writers haven't forgotten about the Wong Kui, the then term for the Cafians, the Kuei Jin. Being the only person in this community that publicly likes them, it is a slight shame that there is only one that exists in this book. It actually begs the question of whether it was worth putting them in there at all. In V20 Dark Ages, the Ramanga, one of the new Liabon presented in the core book, their version of obtenebration is presented with an alternate name, Izena. In addition to how exactly it is different, information I milked for all of its worth in the podcast episode regarding the Ramanga and Zidundu. I was able to do this through the Ramanga Apocrypha, which presents the Abyss in frightening new ways, ones that are just as, if not more so, alien than the vanilla obtenebration. It is not a tool, but a very part of them. You have to roleplay this different from what many would dub La Sombra No. 2. Of course, it is presented as many optional combo disciplines the player can purchase on a mechanical basis, I mean. But if I ever play Ramanga or have to deal with someone who wants to, I am lobbing this book at them and tell them to read page 86. The last domain discussed in this book is in chapter 6 and takes the reader to Mangaluru, an Arabian seaport and major commercial centre in the Indian state of Karnataka, ruled by Rodriel of the Salubri Healer caste. It is an interesting chapter that is mostly for the Ravno and the new Indian Ventru bloodline, the Danuva, expanding the lore on the Nagaraja and Salubri who call Mangaluru the domain, in addition to a vampiric antagonist called the Pisha. Besides this, not a great deal of the chapter inspires or interests me, and I am unsure as to why that is. Despite the fact that you have thaumaturgy spilling over the edges, a borderline mad Salubri at the helm, and the Ravno sending everyone on manic mind trips, I feel the writing does not have the same amount of punch when compared to previous domains. That said, the Apocrypha for the Salubri and Ravno does make them far more interesting and powerful. The final two chapters of the book are about creating and conquering a domain respectively. Out of the two, chapter 7, Building a Domain, is certainly the strongest and easiest to get your head around. It is very clear and straight to the point, making me feel very comfortable how to make a domain in very little time at all. This chapter sneaks in some Tremere Apocrypha also, which is essentially some new rites and rituals, reminding the reader there is more to the Tremere than them being vampiric wizards. The final chapter revises combat in V20 Dark Ages, providing the list of weapons and armors and speeding up the process of the combat tenfold, so you can spend more time playing and less time rolling your d10s. I have nothing to critique here, it is super easy to understand, be it not as engaging as the read of the previous chapter. This book is a very dry read, as many source books are, but it very rarely feels like Vampire the History book, as each chapter provides a different way to engage the reader, pulling you into the town or city and the weird and dark politics and cultures of the Cainites that claim these places as their domains. Where their characters lack stats, the writing ignites wild bonfires of imagination, encouraging storytellers and players to come up with awesome concepts and story hooks. Even if you purchase this book for one place like I did, or just to learn how to make a domain or the weapon charts, it is worth your time, for it is very easy to take one element and dump it in another. It is an inspiring book, even though it can be a bit difficult to read at times. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night podcast brand and the game and book reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100. So, I shall rate this book Black Dog out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.